Oh, hi there, guys. So there were a couple of interesting developments on the right of politics last week. So firstly, there was a rumour doing the rounds on Twitter that Reform UK was looking to install a Muslim woman as their candidate for Mayor of London, when it had been widely assumed that their candidate would be the TV hardman Ant Middleton. So it was all a bit of a nothing burger, really, because nobody's announced their candidates for London Mayor as of yet. But it provoked a bit of a Twitter storm, and there were various people decrying Reform as gone woke. And then there was an interview that Tommy Robinson gave to Dan Wootton, good old Martin Branning himself, where he explained how Reform and Farage were, quote, just the same old bullshit, and that Farage had packed Reform with net zero zealots, ex-Tories, Muslims and lefties. Normally, I don't care too much about the ups and downs on the right of politics. It's not my bag. But we've seen similar stories play out before, and I wanted to consider what it might mean for politics as we head towards the next election in 2029. So I wanted to think about the examples of David Cameron and Rishi Sunak. Now, obviously, they're both very different politicians to Farage, but I think where the similarity lies is that they both wanted to occupy the centre ground while simultaneously stoking the right. So they essentially wanted to ride two horses and get the electoral benefit of that. So if you remember, Cameron, was talking tough on immigration. Remember his promise to get immigration down to the tens of thousands. And he was giving nods and winks about Europe to his wingnut backbenchers prior to the 2015 general election. And he also then had to include a promise in his 2015 manifesto to hold a referendum on membership of the EU to keep them happy and to keep UKIP from siphoning off votes on the right at that election. So Sunak, on the other hand, he pandered to the right at every opportunity on the small boats crisis. He was the one who actually turned it into a crisis, quite amusingly, because he was standing in front of a lectern every few weeks with "Stop the Boats" written on it. So again, this was done to stop Reform peeling off votes on his right. Obviously, it didn't work out too well for either Cameron or Sunak. And the reason for that is that no matter how many inches you give the right, they always want to take a mile. And when neither of Cameron or Sunak were able to sort of follow through on their tough talk, and when they were just exposed for the sort of rich, careless toffs that they always were, they were just tossed to one side and forgotten about. I think the reality is on the right of politics, unless you're pure and untainted in the eyes of the right, and unless you do as asked and then go even further right at the next available opportunity, you're always going to be seen as soft, and you're going to be ripe to be disregarded at a moment's notice. And that neatly brings us back to Nigel Farage. So it's obvious that Farage has been pivoting lately slightly to the centre. So he's had his performative ruptures with Ben Habib and with Rupert Lowe, and his manifesto for the 2024 election was decidedly left-wing in some sections, unbelievably. And as Tommy Robinson said, Farage has invited numerous Tories into the Reform fold. So they've obviously calculated that they've got the far right locked down, and that to gain power in a general election, they need to move a little bit more towards the centre and pick up some of the old Tory vote. But as we saw with Cameron and Sunak in the examples I gave earlier, there's a cost to that. So when you have people to your right, there's always these purity tests on your beliefs and your policies. And there's this sort of constant stream of criticism that you've sold out the British people when you don't do the craziest thing in any given situation. For example, we've left the EU, but we need to leave the EHCR, that sort of thing. So in terms of the wider politics of it all, in my view, I think Farage is sowing the seeds of his own downfall by this sort of pivot back to the centre. And at some point, he's going to be cut loose. That might happen once he's in power and he has to become a sort of more traditional politician where he's making trade-offs and compromises, and when he can't do everything that he promised. And he's already in Westminster now, so he can easily be characterised now as an establishment politician. Or it could come even sooner than that. Maybe Ben Habib's new Advance Party will get off the ground and they'll become to Reform what Reform has been to the Conservative Party. Politics moves so quickly these days, it wouldn't surprise me at all to see that. And Reform are polling at about 30 to 32% currently. It's only going to take 3, 4, 5% of Reform's voters to become disillusioned. And that would be then a sort of fatal blow to their chances of forming the government. So I just wonder, with this sort of pivot more to the centre from Farage, I wonder if he's maybe forgotten what made him successful and if that will be the start of his downfall. I don't know, guys. Let me know in the comments. What do you think? Have I gone mad? Has he really pivoted to the centre? And if he has, what's the consequence of that? But yeah, thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one.